singer who Simon described as having a voice like liquid gold.
Which coincidentally is also what Simon uses to wash his face. Liquid gold. It's Alice Fredenham.
There are certain moments in reality television that stop being just television. They become something people carry around with them. A clip they come back to on a slow afternoon. A memory of the exact place they were sitting when they first heard that voice. For a lot of viewers, one of those moments belongs to a shy, softly spoken woman from Hertfordshire named Alice Fredenham. For about 90 seconds in the spring of 2013, she stood on a stage in front of a studio audience, 3 judges, and millions of people watching from home, and she completely changed the way a room felt. Then, almost as fast as she arrived, she stepped back out of view. This is the story of who she was before that stage, what actually happened during her run on Britain's Got Talent, why the momentum afterward never quite turned into the career everyone expected, and what can honestly be pieced together about where she is and what she is doing today. Reality talent competitions have produced no shortage of viral moments over the years, but very few of them leave the kind of lasting emotional residue that Alice Fredenham's audition did. Most viral talent show clips are remembered for a single quality: the shock of an unexpected voice coming out of an unassuming person, the drama of a judge's reaction, the meme-worthy moment that gets clipped and reposted. Alice's clip has all of those elements, but it also has something rarer, a sense of genuine vulnerability that never fully goes away even after the singing starts. That's part of why, more than a decade later, people are still typing her name into search engines and asking the same question: what actually happened to her? The honest answer is more complicated and more interesting than either of the two easy narratives people tend to reach for. It isn't a simple tragedy, a talented woman chewed up and discarded by a heartless industry. And it isn't a simple redemption story either, a plucky underdog who quietly built a thriving career away from the cameras. It's something messier and more true to how most people's lives actually go. A mix of real opportunity, real setbacks, real personal struggle, and a series of choices that, when you look at them together, start to paint a picture of someone who valued her own well-being over the version of stardom that was dangled in front of her. Before any of this, Alice Fredenham was not someone chasing fame through the usual channels. She grew up in Harpenden, a market town in Hertfordshire, the kind of place that produces a lot of talented people who never audition for anything. She had loved singing since she was young, drawn especially to the jazz and torch song era, the Ella Fitzgeralds and Julie Londons of the world, voices built for smoky rooms rather than arena tours. Rather than pursuing music as a full-time career in her 20s, she worked outside the industry entirely and sang on the side, taking small local gigs in pubs and clubs where the stakes were low and the crowd was forgiving. That distinction matters because it explains a lot of what came afterward. Alice was never a performer who had spent a decade grinding toward a big break, hardened by years of rejection and stage time. She was, by most accounts, a private and somewhat anxious person who happened to have an extraordinary instrument in her voice. That combination, a world-class talent paired with real physical stage fright, would end up defining almost everything that followed. It's a pattern that shows up more often in music than people tend to assume. Plenty of remarkable vocalists spend years, sometimes entire careers, singing exclusively in low-pressure settings: a local pub on a Thursday night, a friend's wedding, a small jazz club where the crowd is there for the atmosphere rather than to judge a performance. In those settings, anxiety can be managed. The audience is forgiving, the stakes are low, and if a note wobbles, nobody's going to clip it and put it on the internet. Television talent competitions strip all of that away. Suddenly, the same voice that felt safe in a 20-person room is being evaluated by 3 or 4 professional judges, a live studio audience, and eventually millions of strangers online, all within the space of a few minutes. For someone whose relationship with performing anxiety was already complicated, that jump in scale isn't a small adjustment. It's an entirely different experience wearing the same clothes. This is worth sitting with because it reframes a lot of what people assume about her story. The question isn't really, why didn't someone this talented make it big? The more accurate question is, what happens to a talented person when the only path to wider recognition, runs directly through the exact situation their anxiety is built to resist. That tension runs through almost every chapter of what came next. What a lot of people don't realize is that Britain's Got Talent was not actually her first attempt at a televised singing competition. Earlier in 2013, she tried out for The Voice UK. She sang "The Lady is a Tramp," a jazz standard that suited her style well on paper. But nerves got the better of her, and not one chair turned. She left that audition without a callback, and by several accounts, without much confidence left either. For most people, that kind of public rejection would be enough to close the door on television talent shows entirely. Instead, within the same year, she decided to try again on a different stage. It's worth pausing on how unusual that decision actually is. Blind auditions, the format The Voice made famous, are in some ways the gentlest possible version of a televised audition. The judges can't see the performer, so at least the fear of visible judgment based on appearance is removed. Even in that relatively protected format, the pressure was enough to keep every chair facing forward. Turning around and trying again on a show with an even more exposed format, one where the judges and the audience see the performer's face and body language from the very first second, took a level of resolve that doesn't always get credited in retellings of her story. Whatever nerves she carried into that Britain's Got Talent audition room, she carried them there voluntarily, fully aware of what a second public failure would look like. Her Britain's Got Talent audition is remarkable, partly because of how secretive she was about it beforehand. She didn't tell her parents. She didn't tell her friends. She reportedly didn't even tell her boyfriend at the time that she had applied. Whether that was superstition, self-protection after the Voice UK experience, or simply not wanting to deal with anyone's expectations, the effect was the same when she stepped out under the lights in front of Simon Cowell, Amanda Holden, David Walliams, and Alicia Dixon. She was doing it essentially alone, with no safety net of encouragement waiting in the wings. She chose My Funny Valentine, a slower, more vulnerable song than the one she had picked for The Voice. Physically, the anxiety was visible. Contestants who have spoken about severe stage fright often describe it the same way Alice later did. It isn't a light case of butterflies. It is closer to a full-body response, trembling hands, a racing heart, a mind that keeps insisting you don't belong there. And yet the second she opened her mouth to sing, none of that carried through into her voice. It was warm, controlled, and unmistakably her own. By the end of the performance, the audience was on its feet, and Simon Cowell, a judge not known for effusive praise, told her she had a voice like liquid gold. The clip spread online within days, and racked up millions of views. Almost overnight, a woman who had been rejected by a talent show panel months earlier became one of the most talked-about singers in the country. If the story ended with that audition, it would be a simple feel-good tale. But her run on the show did not end that way. By the time she reached the semi-final, expectations had shifted from talented contestant to presumed winner, and that shift brought pressure with it. According to reports from the time, there was a late change to her planned song selection before the semi-final, which threw off the preparation she had built around a specific performance. Combined with a stage fright that had never really gone away, her semi-final performance, while still technically strong, lacked the spark of the audition. She was eliminated that round, and just like that, the woman being talked about as a future recording star was off the show entirely. For an audience that had only known her for a few weeks, this felt sudden, and to many, unfair. But it also revealed something important about Alice that would keep resurfacing over the following years. She was never entirely comfortable inside the machinery of televised competition, no matter how good her voice was. There's an uncomfortable irony built into how talent competitions are structured that's worth naming directly. The format rewards, and in some ways requires, exactly the kind of high-pressure, high-visibility performance that someone with severe stage fright is least equipped to handle consistently. A contestant can be extraordinary once, in a single unrepeated moment of adrenaline and instinct, and still struggle to replicate that same magic a few weeks later, under an even brighter spotlight with an even heavier weight of expectation sitting on their shoulders. Judges and audiences rarely factor that in when they're disappointed by a later round performance. The assumption tends to be that the artist has simply gotten worse, rather than that the format itself has made an already difficult situation harder. Alice's semi-final elimination fits that pattern almost exactly. Elimination from a talent show doesn't always mean the end of industry interest, and in Alice's case it didn't. Sony Music reportedly approached her not long after her Britain's Got Talent run with the offer of a demo deal, a common first step where a label pays for a small batch of studio recordings to see whether an artist's sound can translate into commercial material rather than committing to a full album straight away. For an unsigned contestant, this was a real opportunity, and by most standards, a promising one. She went into the studio and recorded a set of demos. What happened next is where the story gets murkier, because Sony never issued a public statement explaining their decision. What is generally understood based on how the industry usually handles these situations is that the label ultimately chose not to move forward with a full record. Alice's sound sat firmly in vintage jazz and easy listening territory, closer to the Great American Songbook than to anything on pop radio at the time. A label weighing commercial potential in 2013 was looking for material that could compete on streaming platforms and radio playlists dominated by pop and dance-adjacent sounds, and a torch song jazz vocalist, however gifted, may simply not have fit that model. It's worth being honest here. Without an official statement from Sony, nobody outside the label can say with certainty why the deal didn't progress. But the pattern, talented niche artist, mainstream label, commercial mismatch, is a familiar one in the music business, and it lines up with what limited reporting exists. For Alice personally, this rejection reportedly landed harder than a typical business setback. She had just come off a public elimination on national television, and now a private door that had briefly opened for her was closing too, without a public explanation to soften the blow. It's worth understanding just how routine this kind of outcome actually is in the music business, even though it rarely gets discussed outside industry circles. Major labels sign far more artists to development or demo deals than they ever release full albums for. It's a low-risk way for a label to test whether a promising voice can be shaped into something that sells at scale, and the vast majority of those test runs quietly end without a record ever reaching shelves. From inside the industry, this is simply how the funnel works. From the artist's side of that same funnel, especially an artist who has just had the strange, disorienting experience of sudden viral fame, it can feel like something much more personal, proof that the thing which made her special to millions of ordinary viewers wasn't special enough for the people who actually decide what gets released. Cause that gap between how the public experienced her talent and how a commercial label evaluated it is one of the more quietly painful threads running through her story. Millions of strangers felt like they'd discovered something rare and important. The institution built to turn that feeling into a career decided otherwise, and never had to explain why to the audience that had fallen for her in the first place. What followed wasn't a dramatic flameout. There was no scandal, no falling out captured by tabloids, no public meltdown. It was something quieter and in some ways harder to watch unfold, a gradual disappearance. Over roughly a year after her BGT run, she continued trying to build something independently, but the visibility that had defined her earlier in 2013 steadily dropped off. Her website eventually went offline. Social media accounts that had briefly been a direct line to fans went quiet. There was no formal retirement announcement, no goodbye post, just less and less activity until there was effectively none. In interviews given not long after the show, Alice was candid about the toll her anxiety took on her. She described stage fright severe enough to trigger panic attacks before performing, the kind of physical response that makes you feel unwell before you've even opened your mouth to sing. That honesty earned her a lot of sympathy from fans, but it also pointed to a genuine mismatch between her temperament and what a modern music career demands. By the early 2010s, building a sustainable career as a singer required constant visibility, interviews, social media presence, touring, self-promotion, being on almost all the time. For someone already struggling with severe performance anxiety, that landscape wasn't just difficult, it was arguably close to the opposite of what she needed. It's worth pausing on this because it's easy to frame her story as a tale of wasted talent or a mismanaged opportunity, but there's another, more human reading of it. An artist with a genuinely rare voice deciding, whether consciously or gradually, that the version of fame on offer wasn't one she wanted to keep chasing, especially when it came at the cost of her mental health. Here is where a lot of tellings of her story get it wrong. Alice Fredenham didn't just vanish after Britain's Got Talent and never resurface. She actually made a real attempt at a comeback, just on a dramatically smaller and more controlled scale than a major label rollout. Starting around 2014, she began performing again, but at low-key events like charity concerts and small local showcases, rather than televised specials. These weren't heavily promoted. Some were advertised through little more than flyers and word of mouth in her local area. For someone whose anxiety was tied to scale and exposure, this makes a lot of sense as a strategy. Smaller rooms mean lower stakes, more control, and a chance to perform without the crushing weight of national attention riding on every note. Around the same period, without a major label behind her anymore, she turned to crowdfunding to finance a debut album on her own terms. She launched a campaign with a fairly modest target, somewhere in the region of £30,000, a realistic figure for an independently produced record, rather than a lavish studio production. The response surprised a lot of people, including, it seems, Alice herself. The campaign didn't just hit its goal, it comfortably exceeded it, eventually raising somewhere north of £40,000. That kind of grassroots support, years after her television appearance, and without an active social media machine pushing it, said something meaningful. The people who had connected with her voice in 2013 hadn't forgotten her, and they were willing to put money behind that memory. The resulting album, Under the Covers, was a collection of jazz and soul standards, very much in keeping with the sound that had made her famous in the first place. It wasn't in an attempt to reinvent herself for the pop market or chase a trend. If anything, it was a statement in the opposite direction. This is who I am as a singer. Take it or leave it. Critically, the response from people who actually heard it was warm. Reviews on music blogs and fan forums praised the clarity of her voice and the restraint in her delivery, the same qualities that had made her audition so memorable in the first place. Commercially, though, the album ran into a familiar independent artist problem: distribution. Without a label's infrastructure behind it, there was no push into physical retail, no radio campaign, no coordinated marketing rollout. It was available digitally and on CD, but reaching new listeners beyond her existing fan base proved difficult. It's a common story for self-funded records. Talented, well-received work that simply can't compete with the reach a label provides, no matter how good the reviews are. After a handful of further small performances, the pattern repeated itself. Public activity slowed, then stopped. Her website went offline again. There was no explanation, no farewell statement, just a return to quiet. It's worth taking a moment to appreciate how genuinely difficult it is to run a successful crowdfunding campaign years after a person's peak public visibility has passed. Kickstarter campaigns tend to succeed either because a creator has a large, currently engaged audience who can be mobilized quickly, or because the pitch itself goes viral in its own right and pulls in new backers on the strength of the idea alone. Alice had neither of those advantages in the conventional sense. Her viral moment was roughly 2 years in the past by the time the campaign launched. She wasn't posting regularly, and she didn't have a management team running a coordinated push. What she had instead was something harder to manufacture: a small but genuinely devoted group of people who remembered exactly how her voice made them feel back in 2013 and were willing to put their own money behind the hope of hearing more of it. That's not the kind of support that shows up in trending algorithms or gets covered by entertainment press. It's quieter, and in its own way more meaningful, because nobody was pushing those backers to pledge. They chose to on their own, off the strength of a memory.